That mirage of a post in Germany was closer to taking on a physical form now that they were in Texas, as that station was a precursor, but once again, Gina's plans were laid for her. When Saddam Hussein's army invaded Kuwait in the first days of August 1990, Kevin's attention switched quickly to war readiness training and preparation for deployment. That fabulous European lifestyle was going to have to wait. He was shipped out by Christmas with the knowledge that his wife may be gone before he returned. Gina had made it clear to Kevin that she knew she would hate being alone. But she was there when Kevin returned from Operation Desert Storm, and eventually the family was off to Germany. Gina loved living in Europe, especially given how free they were about sex in comparison. She was still young and feisty as compared to her much more reserved husband, and this became an issue once he had to come back to the States for training. Pretty much the minute he was gone, Gina set her sights on a young soldier she'd previously locked eyes with, and halfway through her husband's training, Gina told her lover she was pregnant. In her eyes, she was carrying on a highly romantic, exceedingly illicit affair with a new man under everyone's noses, but in reality, it was no secret. Adultery among service members is a deal breaker, and Gina assured her lover that she would not breathe a word about it to anyone, as if it mattered by then. But the pair carried on while Kevin worked hard to get better at his job. He was of higher rank, and fellow officers couldn't help but notice that an officer's wife was carousing openly with the young soldier. It didn't take long for word to reach the young lover's commanding officer, then Kevin back in the States, and he was broadsided. Her lover was thrown out of the army for failing to keep his weight in check, then retreated to his parents' house in Louisiana with Gina right behind him. The truth had come out, and Gina had gone again on the heels of hurled accusations. All the while, Kevin worried about his stepson and told Gina he still loved her. She returned to her mother's in Belleville, Illinois, reuniting with her son, whom she dropped off with family on her way to Louisiana. Gina ultimately agreed to move with Kevin to his new post of Fort Gordon, Georgia, reminding friends that getting out of her mother's house was always her first and most important goal. After 4 years in Germany, Kevin Spann swooped up his wife from her mother's house in April of 1995, and the pair told Gina's son that the family would be reunited once school let out. They settled on the outskirts of Augusta near Peach Orchard Road, a stretch of street housing a collection of necessary businesses, motels, and fast food restaurants. Gina had made it crystal clear to her husband what she would require if she returned to live with him. No more apartments. She wanted a nice-sized home. She expected 2 cars as well, and for reasons unfathomable, Kevin determined that working 3 jobs was reasonable to maintain her. It always came back to Gina's son, who was 11 years old by the time the family shipped off to Fort Gordon. He was the only kid Kevin had to call his own, and they were married, so Kevin was going to do what he needed to for his family. By 1996, the new disease Gulf War syndrome had been making news and destroying lives since the culmination of that conflict. Kevin, like many soldiers who had served in the region, had a vested interest in developments around the disorder. He kept up with all the latest news and grew increasingly concerned about his own health, which had a profoundly negative effect on his relationship with Gina. Gulf War syndrome continues to be researched, but the varying symptoms such as fatigue, rashes, muscle pain, cognitive issues, and diarrhea have been linked to chemical exposure to agents like nerve gases, pesticides, toxic smoke, and to a preventative drug administered to soldiers in war. Psychological traumas can also play a role. As more soldiers came home, doctors began linking more and more disorders to Gulf War syndrome, including birth defects and reproductive issues, and this is when Kevin began to really panic. Although by this point in their relationship, he knew for certain that Gina couldn't have any more kids, Kevin had difficulty accepting that he might not be able to either. And his wife was upset that he was even worried about it, especially since they had a child in their home. Just after a year in Georgia, Gina and her son were headed back to Belleville, Illinois, and her mother's house, the place from which she was usually trying to escape. Kevin was left in Georgia to figure out what he could do to get his wife to come home. It was the summer of 1996, and back on her mother's couch, 30-year-old Gina Spann discovered the wide-open world of internet chat rooms. Day after day, she booted up the family computer and lost herself in finding new friends. There were so many to choose from, and she knew exactly the kind of man she could easily manipulate. She found him in 19-year-old Jesse Dunn. He lived with his parents in West Virginia, but within days of meeting online, Gina alternately flirted and regaled the teen with tales of a lack of domestic bliss in her home. He was just a regular kid who found himself put under a spell by this woman who loved to talk, especially about sex, which their conversations soon began to revolve around. They spent Mother's Day chatting online, and by Memorial Day, Gina was headed to West Virginia to rendezvous with her pen pal in person. After 5 days together in a cheap motel room, the freshly christened lovers set off for Augusta, Georgia. Somehow, Gina had persuaded Jesse to move back to Georgia with her, convincing him that she was leaving her abusive husband, whom Jesse knew as Sandy, not Kevin. The new lovers holed up in a rented unit in Grovetown, Georgia for an entire month, with Jesse never knowing that Kevin Spann was paying for it. He and his wife had been speaking while separated, even while Gina and Jesse were growing their relationship. After a few weeks in the love nest, Gina ventured out with Kevin, but his idea of a first step back in their marriage ended in a fight, of course, and it was due to her unrealistic demands, as it often was. Kevin's friends and even Gina's family wondered aloud why he couldn't keep away from her, and a lot of it was her child. Kevin really wanted to try and give Gina's son a stable home, whether she did or not. Gina told Kevin that she would move back in with him, but not into their old house by the strip mall. She wanted something better, and Kevin went out the next day and got his wife what she wanted. The Spanns would now be residing on Old Waynesboro Road in a nicer home than before. The kicker was that Gina was still scheming, and she was moving Jesse into her marital home, which was news to him as well. The crazy part is that, for almost a week, Jesse was there in the house, unbeknownst to Kevin, before he and Gina took off for a few days to reevaluate their plan. Kevin only found out about Jesse from his sister-in-law, as she drove Gina's son to Georgia once school let out for the summer. The pair returned and Kevin demanded a divorce, but Gina was determined to have what she wanted and was able to convince both men they could live harmoniously under one roof. Never one to approach confrontation, Kevin just let it happen. He didn't want to get divorced, and Gina made it clear that she and her son would have nowhere to go, and as we know, Kevin was always concerned about the boy. So Gina's son had a bedroom, Kevin had a bedroom, and Gina and Jesse erected a makeshift space of their own in the family room. Jesse had been made to believe that Gina's husband's name was Sandy, but the man he was introduced to was Kevin. And all that stuff Gina had said about being abused, He didn't see any of that either, and he began to realize he was being deceived. Gina used the stories of abuse to keep the teen away from Kevin, but Jesse could see the man wasn't abusive or any of the things she had told him that Sandy was. The thing about Gina was that she was bright. Maybe she wasn't brilliant or a genius, but she was smart and could tell which men needed something she could provide. Conversation, companionship, adventurous sex. Gina knew when to turn it on. She knew how to make her man feel special and like the only guy in the world. Neither man wanted to lose her, so both men stayed. Over time, they even developed somewhat of a cordial relationship, mostly because they didn't want to cause drama in front of Gina's son. Jesse sensed that Kevin felt stuck there, especially given his rank in the military and the small-town controversy the divorce could cause. It was just easier to keep his wife happy. Although another stipulation of her return was a monthly stipend, Gina started working to supplement her marital allowance. A boyfriend was an expensive addition to a household, and Kevin's army paychecks wouldn't cut it, even with his recent promotion to supervisor in Company D Signal Battalion 442. Gina began working at fast food joints along that same strip of businesses she used to live by, in the house she hated. But now, safely installed in her new job at Taco Bell, Gina continued toward the future she always dreamed about. Like many towns in America, there just wasn't much for teenagers to do on the outskirts of Augusta, Georgia, and Gina's Taco Bell restaurant on the Peach Orchard Road Strip was a popular student hangout. She started to befriend her young co-workers, including 17-year-old Larry Kelly, and soon she and a few others found themselves partying on a regular basis. Though she was more than a decade older, the boys liked that she had a car and was of age, so their partying difficulties were over. Gina was soon renting motel rooms and supplying the teens with alcohol, while they in turn kept her stash of drugs full. In time, Gina brought the party to her house on Old Waynesboro Road, as she was spending virtually all of the money she was making at Taco Bell on partying. Marijuana, cocaine, crack, and acid were Gina's party drugs of choice, and it wasn't long until she and Larry had taken their relationship to the physical plane. Both Larry and his older brother Michael worked at the restaurant with Gina, and now her live-in teenage boyfriend Jesse did too. He hung out with the group sometimes, but overall didn't approve of Gina's lifestyle. Since Kevin worked long hours, someone needed to tend to the house and look after Gina's son, and those tasks ultimately fell to Jesse, just a few years her son's senior. It wasn't hard to see that Gina's behavior was having an adverse effect on her child. At 12, he was known to act out and throw tantrums. Eventually, he didn't really speak to anyone but his stepdad Kevin. This non-traditional familial environment was not working in the child's favor, and soon it wasn't working in Jesse's anymore either. So, he bought a one-way ticket back to West Virginia and was gone. Gina's co-workers at Taco Bell were sad to see him treated so poorly, never mind Kevin Spann's feelings, as they were told the couple had an open marriage. It never occurred to them that Gina could be moving teenage lovers into their marital home against his wishes. He had to think it was okay. But in reality, soft-spoken Kevin was not okay with it, and he threatened Gina every so often with divorce. She was always able to divert his attention away from the idea, even just for a while, because she couldn't risk a second divorce. This time, Gina would be losing so much more than she did the first time. Kevin had a respectable military career going, which came with a decent savings and retirement plan for the future. Not only that, but there were multiple life insurance policies naming her as the primary beneficiary, and really, it was financial stability that she craved. It seems in hindsight that installing gullible teenaged